10 more laps. 10 more laps. 10 more laps. 10 more laps to go. My 66 model has been raring to go. I worked a lot of hours getting her ready to go, fixing up the engine so she won't blow. I'll be a winner, I know. 10 more laps. 10 more laps. 10 more laps. 10 more laps to go. I was running way ahead of all the other cars. I was doing fine and everything was good so far. Track was getting hotter with the melting of the tar. 10 more laps to go. 10 more laps. 10 more laps. 10 more laps.
Hello there. Welcome to Paul's Place. We're back in the studio this afternoon, taping a show that I've had requests for the last 2 or 3 years. It's not going to be on racing today. It's going to be a little bit different. We're going to do, something as unorthodox, I guess the word going to say, of what you can do with recorded sound, collecting records, and a lot of paraphernalia in that direction. I've cleaned out my basement and my garage a little bit, brought 4 tables full of stuff down here. We got it laid out, and we're going to try to make some sense out of what Edison did back in 1877 up to today. I don't think we'll get into CDs or anything, but if we can go from the turn of the century when recording was really starting to maybe 1957, 1958, 1960, right in there. That'd be the end of the 78 era. That's when 45s and 33s more or less crowded the 78s out of the picture, and since then they've been crowded out by the CDs and DVDs and BVDs and a few other things. But in 1877, Edison invented the phonograph. He took a piece of tin foil and stretched it around a drum, and then he perforated it with Mary Had a Little Lamb. And then he played it back. And he showed this to people, and it's the first time that anybody heard sound recorded and it came back again. In 1600, there was a guy by the name of Scott did something what he called an auto photograph, and it was done with smoke and mirrors and stuff like that, but it was never to be played back. But here in the last couple of years, a couple in our club, the Michigan Phonograph Society and the Indiana Society, were able to reproduce sound on what this man had, and they won an Academy Award. So technology today is getting better to where they can go back and reclaim sound. But what we're going to start with, and what people keep asking me, is when did it start and what was it like? And I've got this record, what's it worth, and how come this is worth more than that one, and this one isn't as rare as that, or something like that, and stuff like that. So we're going to get started here this afternoon and do a little talk on it, and we're going to show you some things and then go from there. You're not very well off if you don't have a library. You've got to have books to do a little bit of this stuff. And one of the best books that, when it comes to collecting and everything that I got, is this book I got right in front of me. It's sold by a guy by the name of Kurt Knox out in Houston, Texas. And this book has got about every label that you can think of in there. It gets right down to the nitty-gritty on when they were made. In fact, I found some records here in the last couple of years in here that were only made from January through February, and they had Victor's code on it and everything else. It's when Victor sold something back to Columbia. And it turns out that these records are very rare, and so if you don't have the library, you don't know this. So if you're going to be in the collecting business, you've got to come up with a lot of books. I know I probably got a couple 300 of them, but some of them are worthless, or not worthless, they're all worth something, but some of them you don't use that often to where you need it out of this. But you can find quite a bit of information in this book. You don't find a lot of these books in the library. They were recorded and printed, but they never ended up in the library. Like I said earlier, around, I'm going to say, the turn of the century, recordings got to be practical. Up until then, they were still experimenting. Edison tried brown wax, and he tried white wax, he tried black wax, and his cylinders were playable, but they weren't, I don't know, this is something you wouldn't spend money on, I guess. But in the late 80s, 1880 or something like that, there was another guy involved in the problems with recorded sound. His name was Emil Berliner. He was German, but he came out of Canada, same place that Edison's folks came from originally. And Emil Berliner was up in Montreal and came down, and he moved into Washington, D.C., and he more or less stayed in that area most of his life, where he had a laboratory there in the city itself. Emil Berliner was the man that invented the flat disc. The flat disc, Edison never made one of these until 1913, and he called it a diamond disc. But from, I'm going to say, the turn of the century, 1895, 2000, or 1900, right in through there, this little piece of hard rubber, which were the early ones, this was what people listened to. And like I've told earlier on other shows, what goes around comes around, and this is a circle. There's only one groove on a record. It starts on the outside and ends on the inside. And I guess that's about the only common thing you can say, because down through the years, different people have done different things with these things, and they still maintain a way of entertaining you. But Emil Berliner basically thought that he could put all of his knowledge onto one of these and use it for a system, a bookkeeping system or something like that, in his record business and stuff like that. But Edison, when he invented the cylinder machine, he figured it was going to be for entertainment, and that's about it. And that's how it did. But it all ended up as entertainment, even though later on they used it for, schools used it for teaching, and factories and everything else used it for knowledge. I know they used to have a little machine that beeped, and you pushed the button and then it went on and say something else. And it was a slide part with a camera. And the very early film, Edison invented a photograph, the moving picture, around the turn of the century also. And the very first ones of them, well, they weren't talkies, but the talkies came on later. They had maybe 4 records. I had a record from one of those, but I couldn't find it, dig it out to bring it to the show. But you put it on, and sometimes they got off key from what the slide was, and the picture would be showing something else, and the people's mouth would be moving somewhere else. I've seen a few of them. But anyway, this was the very first recorded sound that we knew, and it, I guess, exploded from there and went all the way up to what we see today. And like I say, what goes around comes around. The very first ones of these were 5-inch, recorded on one side. And if you look at what you bought for Christmas, this thing is a 5-inch. It's recorded on one side. That goes around, comes around. The only difference is how you get the sound out of it. When Edison built his, and there were two different grooves back in those days. Edison had his, which we would describe today as beta, for all you that remember the VHS tapes. VHS was one and beta was the other. Beta was really a good sound and everything, but it never took off, where VHS was faster and everything else, and it took off and it set the pace. Well, Edison recorded everything he had on the top of the groove. And the 78s that we know was recorded in the bottom of the groove. So with an Edison machine or a Pathé or one of those, you needed a sapphire stylus, and it rode on top of the groove. For a 78, you needed a steel needle with a point, and it actually recorded out of the bottom of the groove. Everybody got involved, it seemed like, all of a sudden. Records were coming out of the woodwork. Columbia got started up in business. Victor was started, but really Victor really didn't take off. Eldridge Johnson had a machine, but he didn't have a motor. The other way around. Eldridge Johnson had the motor, but he didn't have much of a machine. Berliner had a machine, but no motor. Those two got together after the turn of the century, and they started the Victor Phonograph Company. The Victor Phonograph Company then was in business until the stock market crashed in 1929, and RCA cabbaged onto Victor, and they had it up through the 60s, and they sold it to Sony, and I don't know, it went back through hands a couple times, but it's back, I think, as RCA again. I think Sony and all them are out of it, but it was early on RCA or early on Victor, and it stayed that way. And a lot of the books that we read and stuff like that about early Victor is the Pre-Dog and Monarch records and stuff like that, where it's got Berliner on it. Pre-Dog is our dog over there, Nipper. Nipper was actually from England. He was a real dog. He lived over there before the turn of the century, and his master's voice, the painting that Brote made of Nipper, listening to the phonograph, was his master's voice, and that was supposed to be where the dog sat on the casket after the master had passed away. And that was brought over here by Emo Berliner. And it's once him and Eldridge Johnson got together and formed Victor, then Johnson kept Nipper, and Nipper is probably the most publicized trademark in the world. He's been around ever since. In fact, now there's Chipper along with Nipper, and these dogs go everywhere, I guess. Anyway, people have asked me what makes a record rare when there's so many of them out there. The rare records are the ones that they didn't make too many of, and also in the best of condition. You can take a Berliner record like this. These records commonly sell for around $35 a piece. There weren't a lot of them made, and you got to figure that these things are, well, this one here was, he dated everything, but this one here was in 97, July of 97, and the patent date on it is February of 95. So it's been around over 100 years, and if if you moved a lot or you was in a hot climate or something like that, this record would probably not be around. But it doesn't really make them rare just because they're selling for $35. There's records all over the country that way. Some of the rarer records were the smaller ones. This was made by the Harper Book Company. Columbia made these. Columbia itself was in the record business just like RCA and Edison, but they also made machines. And it wasn't and we'll get to that later on in the program, but you could go to Columbia and tell them what you wanted, and they would make a machine for you and be yours, have your name on it and what have you. They also did this with records for books, and that's where these came from. There was other records down through the times. This one was made by Marathon. I don't think that's Marathon Oil, but that's who made this one. Here's one that was made by the Harvard Disc Company. Harvard also made a machine. You don't see too many of them. Harvard was associated really with Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. They made machines for them also, and these are one-sided records. Columbia, the very first ones that they made were small disc, one-sided, not any bigger than that. But like Victor, on the back side of it, they got their manufacturing and their license and everything else, and it says here the price of this record throughout the United States is 50 cents. So they had a fair trade thing back then, that you didn't sell these records for less than 50 cents or you wouldn't get any more. I think Edison had a little bit to do with some of that, because he kept his jobbers pretty tight also. Victor, the Victor talking machine, they had a small record, and it's, if it didn't have Victor on it, if none of these had a label on them, you couldn't tell them apart. You wouldn't know whether there was a Victor or Columbia, a Marathon or whatever. But this was the very first, and then as time went on, this record was pressed in 1920 by Melodisc, and it says right on the top that this record will play on any phonograph. Not true. There were some phonographs that would not play a 78 record. They would play a 78 record with a sapphire groove, whereas this one here is a 78 with a steel needle. So it would not play on all of them. Emerson is another name that we know yet today, Emerson Radio and Emerson so on. Emerson got into business also, and this is red, white, and blue. Most of theirs were all patriotic colors like that that they had. And like I say, these records started out at the turn of the century, and then they ran them till, I'm going to say, around 1910. Now, a lot went on with what went on. Here's one this was Oxford. Now, Oxford, they're not around anymore, but I've picked up quite a bit of Oxford stuff here in the last couple of years. These are one-sided records, and the blanks that they made for this has also got the dot in it, where you could punch the dot hole out and use it for a Berliner that had the drive pin in the side of it. So whoever pressed Oxford used discs that was actually used for Berliner used these, and there's another company used them. So they were practical, but in the meantime, up until the turn of the century, there was no such thing as a phonograph company or a record company or anything like that. You went out in the park, and you had a place out in the park where the bands all got together on Sunday afternoon and played songs, and they have marching bands and so on. Now we got studios, and Edison had their studios, Columbia had theirs, Eldridge Johnson had his, and so on, and that's where they signed up all the known singers around, and they recorded their songs, and they'd sign them up under contract, and then I got a book on that. We'll get to that later on. Len Spencer would He's on this Oxford label, a Newsboy Christmas song, and maybe he'd sing for Columbia. He'd be under a different name. There's personams in that book. Well, even Bing Crosby and Gene Autry had some that they sang on different tunes, and this is as late as the 40s. So there was a lot of singers back that way that did things like that, and then there was a lot of them that they were outlaws, like we used to race outlaw. They used to be the same way with recording. They'd record for anybody, and they never signed a contract for anybody. Cal Stewart was one of them, and he was actually Uncle Josh Weatherby. He did a lot of vaudeville stuff. Cal Stewart was born down here in Tipton, Indiana. If you ever get down there, go out to the cemetery, and there's a real nice tombstone and everything that they've got decorated up of Cal's. He was quite a vaudeville guy. Uncle Josh and the Automobile and Uncle Josh, what have you. But anyway, without a good bunch of knowledge, and with this, when I first got into the phonograph business or started collecting these things 45 years ago, there weren't no books around. But today there's quite a few books. It seems like everybody that got a little bit of knowledge or knew where they were something they could get a hold of and print it. They printed books, and I probably got one shelf full of books that was printed in the last 5 years. They're all interesting. They've all got knowledge in them. They've all got history in them, and they're not too much of it. It's not fact. There's not a lot of fiction in any of them. But if you're going to get into the collection and stuff like that, you need to get the books to go with it. Because without that, like I use the whole phrase, it's like winking at a girl in the dark. You know what you're doing, but she don't. So anyway, as 1905, maybe 1906 or 1907 came along and went, things were improving. Recorded sound was getting better. The very first records were made out of hard rubber, and they weren't very practical, but they did come up with a noise, and people never heard this before, so compared to what, it sounded good, because they didn't have anything to compare it to. But after 4 or 5 records, quality control wasn't part of their system back then, because you could go down to the record store and buy a record or a cylinder and take it home and put it in your machine, and it'd have about half the volume as the one you just got through playing. And maybe you bring 3 or 4 records home, or 3 or 4 cylinders, and play them all, and all 3 or 4 of them have a different amount of volume. But that's the way the game was. That came with the territory, because they didn't have any way to test them or check them out. So that's what you got, and you played it, and then if it didn't have a lot of volume, maybe after a while they cost a whole 35 cents, a cylinder did, and records were a little bit cheaper. And of course some of these were 50 cents, but some of them got up to $1, and maybe later on you'd go buy another, and it'd have a little more volume than what you had. But Edison stayed with a cylinder. He never went with a flat disc until 1912, when he came out with the Ambrolas. And in 1912 he also came out with what they called the diamond disc. And the diamond disc was a 10-inch record. It was a cardboard insert and had celluloid top and bottom, and that's what was, the sound was pressed into the celluloid, and then it had a celluloid ring, a 1/4-inch ring went around it. All Edison records were 1/4-inch thick. This is an Edison. I don't know which camera I'm going to be on. There we are. But this one here is a 1/4-inch thick, and it's cardboard on the inside. It's celluloid on each side, and it's got a celluloid ring around it, and then it's got a number stamped in that ring, and that tells you what the, if you look in the book, that'll tell you what the record is. This one is one of Edison's last records, and we'll get to that later on in the program. It's a 12-inch and not a 10-inch. But Edison stayed with the cylinders. Columbia, Victor. Victor never had a cylinder. Columbia did, and they went out of the brown wax into the black wax, and then into the celluloid. Indestructible records were all celluloid. But staying with the flat disc that we're talking about today, Columbia probably was leading the pack. Eldridge Johnson and Berliner was trying to get Victor going, and they had a good program, and they had about everything going with them. But somewhere on one of these tables, I laid out a Columbia program. We'll just take them all over here. This is a Columbia demonstration record, and Columbia came out with these. It's double-side special demonstration double-side record, and says this record is not for sale to the owners of the talking machine. Your dealer is authorized to give you this Columbia double disc record free of charge except the incidental cost or packaging and delivery. And it's a demonstration record, and what it was is the first records that we were talking about were one-sided. This record here has got two sides to it. Somebody woke up in the middle of the night and said, hey, if we can press the record on one side, why can't we flip it over and press the other side? And then we'll have twice as much music or twice as much talking for the same amount of money. So somebody came up with that idea, and here it says right here, special Columbia record, 25 cents, and it's a double disc, and it'll play on all standard makes, and on the back side it shows all the record players that it was going to play on. It's special advertising record. Good night, little girl, good night. And advertised for a quarter. So I guess maybe that's where 2 bits came in on something like that. Also, there was a Columbia. Hope I got it. I got it with me. This is a Columbia with a blue label, and this is also a special record, a very important record, because on the flip side it says the Panama Pacific International Exposition souvenir record, price of $1. The Star Spangled Banner sang by Margaret Woodrow Wilson, and that was the president's daughter. It's on this record here. This record of my voice, if sold by the Columbia Phonograph Company, shall yield to the American Red Cross the sum of 25 cents, covering my entire royalty. So she donated all of her royalty to the Red Cross on this record, and I'll get her right there. But this record sold for $1, and it's a medley of the patriotic airs on this side, and Yankee Doodle, and Columbia, the Air of the Ocean, and Marching Through Georgia, and Dixie. But this record here was sold by Columbia, and all the royalties from Woodrow Wilson's daughter went to the Red Cross. Now, talking about rare records, now here's one that they probably made a lot of them, and they were probably out, and people played them and broke them, I guess, because you don't see these. They'll show up once in a great while at an auction. Your best chance of finding one like this is in in a collection of some older people that maybe had an old 78 or something like that, where they had 40 or 50 records in a box in the basement, where it wasn't a damp basement or it wasn't a hot attic, and you'll find something like this. But they're rare, they're hard to come by, and when you do find one, somebody says, well, what's it worth? It's only worth what two people want to fight over it for. It might bring $10, it might bring $110. I've seen some of these records go over $100. I've seen some of them get up around $20, and everybody thinks, well, that's more than I want to put in it. I'll just leave. But it's all depends on what you want to put in it. Your money is about what something like this is worth. We talk about Sun Records. Sun Records was made in Memphis, Tennessee, and what made Sun Records famous was they were the first ones that Elvis Presley sang on, and they were also Jerry Lee Lewis, it was on them, and Blue Suede Shoes, he was on them. But anyway, Sun label records are still, they're worth a lot of money today. They weren't out that long, but here's one of the first Sun labels. This one here has also got a thing on the back, disclaimer, I guess you'd call it. And this disclaimer shows that this record was probably pressed in around 1905, 1906, right in there. And it's a very early Sun record. It has nothing to do whatsoever with Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, but they were the very earliest of a Sun record. And Hans and Gretchen, Ada Jones and Len Spencer again, so it has to be back in the teens, so where it came from. Also back in those days, there was a movement on by 2 or 3 phonograph companies that thought if you buy our machine, you have to buy our records. So we will make our records so they'll only play on one machine. So come on down and let's see what you got. Columbia built all of these machines. These machines were built between 1902 and 1904, right in through there. I brought one with me. I think we can get over on this side of the table. It's this green horn machine. This is an Arantino. Arantino was probably the rarest of the 4 machines that was made at that time. And what it was, it had an opening this big. And the record here was Bake That Chicken Pie, and it's an Arantino record, and it's sweet and clear, it says. It had that big of a hole in it. And you bought their machine, and you put the record on, and it fit through that hole, and that was it. The others that first started, the very first one was the Standard Record Company. Standard built this record and built their machine, and it had a 9/16 hole in it instead of a 5/16. A regular mandrel, or the regular pin for a 78 or even a 33, was a 5/16. This has got a 9/16 hole in it. And another company, Harmony come out with one, and they thought, well, we need to make a bigger hole in it. This one is 3/4 of an inch. And so if you buy our record, you buy our machine and you buy our record, and this is what it looks like. And this is made by the Harmony Talking Machine, and their address was 618 South Dearborn Street in Chicago, Illinois. And so they ran something like that. United came along. United, they list theirs as 608 South Dearborn Street, Chicago, Illinois, United Records, and they've got a 1-inch hole in here. And this 1-inch hole, if you buy, there's the turntables had this boss on there so that you couldn't play anything smaller than that on that unless you took the turntable off, chucked it up in a lathe, which I've done, and turned this boss down to 5/16, or turn it completely off and re-drill it and put a 5/16 pin in there so you can play regular 78 records. And earlier I was talking about things that I did when I first started collecting. I didn't know too much about these things, and when they showed up, I thought they were a little bit different, so I had to have one of each. I had a Yankee Prince, I had well, I still got this Arantino, I've got a couple standards. I've still got one United, but I do not have a Harmony. I had a Harmony and I sold it to somebody, but I'd probably been in, there were no clubs or anything when I first started collecting until the Michigan Antique Phonograph Society started in 1976. In 1980, I joined it. In, I don't know, about 82 or 83, I was at a meeting and we always had show and tell and stuff like that. And I brought what I thought was pretty interesting up there. I had these machines, but I also had some Columbias and Victors. And to play these records, which I probably got 50 or 60 of each one, my son-in-law worked in a machine shop, and I had him turn me down some brass pins. This is a Harmony pin. It's 3/4 size. And this is a standard pin. This is 9/16. The center of it's drilled out to 5/16, so you just put it over the center pin of the record player, and then you could play these records. And the same way with the Arantino. And everybody thought that was a pretty good idea. I made probably 10 sets of them for men in the club. And about, I don't know, I'm going to say 3 months later, we get our newsletter every month, and here's a guy in Houston, Texas. He made them out of plastic, and he patented them. And so I bought a set off of him. They are nice. They're colored different plastics, and so you can take these records and put them on a Victor machine, or you can put them on a Columbia machine or something like that and play them. But it was just one of them novelty things that went along with recording back in the olden days. So one of the things, like I talked earlier about Edison with their Hill and Dale recording, on the top of it, no Edison machine ever used a steel needle. The only Edison machine that used a steel needle was an adapter you could buy and put on an Edison machine to play regular 78s. That's the only time you ever seen an Edison machine with a steel needle, because the diamond disc, which this reproducer here goes to, and the cylinder machines, which I didn't bring one with me, but they have a stylus, diamond stylus they call it, but actually it's a sapphire. And that rides right in the groove of the record and picks up the sound. And the record is so fine, as this thing is going like this, it sits there and it vibrates around. And if you would accidentally get this screw in the back too tight, this thing would skip. And it took a little, one of the things I learned in life one Saturday morning is how I could get the skip out of an Ambrola 50 until I realized what this thing was doing. Also, on a 78 record player, the steel needle followed the groove from the very first to the end. And on an Edison, this set on a groove, but it had a gear down in the bottom, and it would take this across the record. Same way with the cylinder. The cylinder had a half nut that fit into an all thread, and it took this reproducer across the cylinder and picked up a sound. So you never really had this holding into the record of any way. Pathé, which is French, had a sapphire record also. Rex made one, and but Pathé, they made them both ways. On the record it said Sapphire or U.S. consumption. If it said U.S. consumption, you could play it with a steel needle. If it said Sapphire, you had to put a pointed sapphire needle in your reproducer, and you could buy these at any record store. If this is a tone arm off of Pathé, to play a Victor record, this is just the way it would set with the record underneath it, and the steel needle here would pick up the sound and it come through here. Well, if you played a Pathé or an Edison record on it, you turned it forward like that, and then you took this steel needle out and you put the one in. An Edison was a round ball, would fit in there, and if it was a Pathé or a Rex or one of those, it had a point on it, and it would pick it up. And the reverberation would be going this way with it on a Hill and Dale, whereas on a 78, sitting there like that, the reverberation is going this way. So that's the difference between a Hill and Dale and a regular 78. That was, I guess, where we compared Edison to Beta and Victor and Columbia and all the rest of the steel needle phonographs to VHS, and I guess we're getting into that now with DVDs. I haven't paid too much attention to it. But that gets us into the records to around 1920. Everything was 78s. This is another thing everybody says, why the 78 RPM? The reason why it was 78 is that was the only motor they had. That's when they first started. 78 speed was it, 78 and 80. And Edison, when he built his diamond disc, he was turning that at 80 RPM, but there's very little difference between 80 RPM and 78 RPM. You can't hardly, you gotta have a real good ear to pick it up. In Chicago Tribune, June 15th of 86, Vil Vittel wrote a real nice article about why the speeds that you have and why the different ones and what have you. And really the speed, the 78s, our 78 stayed around till 1957, 1958, and then it disappeared, which, I don't know, we didn't have any other speeds until 1932. 1932, of course, there's a big depression on, nobody's got any money, but somebody came up with a speed of 33 1/3, but radio stations and studios and that couldn't convert over, and the people that bought records and everything else were farm people and everything, so they didn't, the 33 just never took off. It finally did take off in about 1946, 47, right after Victor came out with the 45. Columbia came out with the 33 speed with 5 records or 5 songs on each side of the record, and that's really when vinyl came out and replaced the 78. And because 78s, I don't know, you could maybe get 2 songs out of a 78. I've seen some split discs where there were 2 songs on a 78 on each side, so it had 4, and that's the same thing that RCA did with its ET, extended AP, extended play 45, that where they had 2 songs on each side. But Columbia had everybody hands down, because you could buy a 33 1/3 record and you get 10 songs on it and 10 good ones, and this was practical, and that, like I say, that finally put the 78s to sleep. But 45s came on, and 45s, oh, they're still around. 33s, I guess they're pressing them again to get the quality out of them. But that's getting me back up into the 20s. One of the things that they had also back in those days that we haven't touched on was the toys. Around 1908, Columbia came out with a toy that you could play with on your phonograph, and I know whenever I set up at shows and everything, I always take along one of mine that plays on a 78 record. I made a mistake by not bringing my fourth phonograph with me that would play these, but this was what they called a Siam Sioux doll, and it's set on the record, and it had its own record, and it had a wheel in the back of it, and the wheel would turn, and Siam Sioux would do a hoochie coochie dance. When it's in operation, it's with the right song and everything. It's quite a thing to look at. I guess they had parties back in the olden days, and that's what they get the record out and play this song. This was not the most practical one. The other one that they got had a little more action. This is all that Siam did in her hoochie coochie days. Getting back to this toy was first made about the same time. This one here set on a 78, and it was on a cam, and it would dance. But everything that I brought today, the pin won't fit on this, so consequently we don't play it. And they had different dowels for it, and they had boxers and fighters and everything else. Now these pretty much fun to watch, but this was taken off to where the records were, I don't know, you buy a march, or you bought a sad song, or you bought a vaudeville, and I don't know, that it was just something to have. But anyway, the records. They had another one. Victor called them puzzle records. This part one puzzle record contains 3 tunes, and can you name one? And that's what it is. And there's 3 grooves on this record. This record on the backside, it's got 3 other tunes. But what you did was you put the record down, and you can't see where it cuts in, but it'll play a tune and maybe won't have any drums in it, or you'll play a tune with no horns in it, or you'll play a tune with no piano in it. And the very next one will have one or both of them in it. And it's a puzzle record. They've also got one with the lineup, which has horse racing in there. And the horse racing was Cinch and Bound Town and Best Bet and Repeater and Easy Does It. And that's 5 of them, so there's 5 grooves on this one. And I've played this a lot of times, and the same part don't never come up the same. Always something. When it gets down to the very end, where it comes off the end, where they're talking about how close the race is, and then Easy Does It wins, or Repeater wins, or something like that. So they were puzzle records, and from what I've been told by other people that collected these, I guess they had these in bars, and they used to bet quarters on them. Everybody threw down a quarter, and grab one of them numbers of who's going to win, and whoever wins rakes up the quarters. It was just something else that they had back in those days. Those records were popular in the late 20s and early 30s. So consequently, that's recorded sound up until, I'm going to say before the stock market crashed. They were still improving the quality and the quantity of 78 records at this time, but they had a long way to go because they were still improving them in 1947, 1948, when I used to listen to them in high school, and there was a lot of stuff to be desired when it came to sound and so on. So I'm going to say that before the stock market crashed, there were, I'm going to say, 20 or 30 people building phonographs. They were cabinet shops all over the country. They were record studios in all the big cities. RCA, Columbia, Edison, you name it, were all recording some kind of song. You could go down, and music wasn't expensive in the 20s. You could go down and buy a record for 15 cents or so on. It wasn't until the Depression hit that the bottom fell out. And then when the bottom fell out of it, a lot of companies went under. Victor got sold to RCA. Columbia stayed together, but they took a hit, but a lot of companies just went belly up. Edison didn't go bankrupt, but Edison could see the handwriting on the wall with the radio coming on, because radio started in the early 20s, and a lot of the later Victor machines in 1928, 29, and so on were equipped with a radio. And Edison could see that the radio was coming on. He just closed the door on the phonograph business. Edison today is still in business, and so is Columbia. But it just wasn't practical to try to sell the public as something that they didn't want or they couldn't afford. And with the Depression out there, what did stay finally survived, but a lot of them didn't. One of the things that they had during the Depression was a hit of the week. This record here, you could drop it and it didn't break. This was what they call Durham. It's a cardboard. This on the back side of it, it's got Rudy Valley and his Connecticut Yankees. And on the front side, and like I say, it's flexible, and that's what you had for a record. And on it also, it had a. Now there's another. Here's the only other guy, Nick Lucas, that I've ever seen on the back of one of these records. They're the only two pictures of them I've ever seen, but the other one gives the price of 15 cents. You could buy this record at any newsstand for 15 cents, take it home, play it on your 78 RPM machine, and it was practical. And they didn't break. The only thing that they did, if you didn't keep them laying flat and keep something on them, they warped. This one here says, "This hit of the week record is given to you with the compliments of your news dealer and Liberty Magazine. Hit of the week records are sold at all newsstands for 15 cents. That's on the back side of that. And this record here is J3, and Many Happy Returns of the Day. It was for Maxwell House Coffee, who back in them days everybody advertised some sort the best they knew how. But this was from the Depression. So what more, it wasn't until later on that the record industry changed quite a bit. One of them was Edison. Edison finally came out in 1928 or 29 with a long play record. This is an Edison long play record right here. It's a 12-inch. This record plays for 40 minutes, and it's a 40-minute long record, but you can only play it on an Edison machine. It will not play on anything else, and you got to use the adapter, the 40 or the long play adapter on it, and you got to put it in the long play mode. It will play the other mode with that diamond disc reproducer and play the regular diamond disc at 80 RPM. But when you switch gears on it and put this record on, then this would play for 40 minutes. This was towards the end of Edison's record business. Here again, these weren't practical. There are not too many of them around. Well, nobody had them. A lot of people didn't have an Edison machine to begin with, and when this came along, they could care less about them. So that is where that one ended up at. Only the other part of it is Edison and Henry Ford had a deal. They were both together, and Henry Ford and Edison had machines that, Edison would make them and give them to Henry, and Henry had a dance band and all that on his own. So up until the Depression and back to the turn of the century, I hope I've inspired somebody to what recording was like and what it is, and it's been an interesting hour. It's the fastest hour I ever get into, I guess, even with racing. So I don't know, maybe somewhere along the line, I know I'm going to have to do a two-parter on this and come up with a second part and take it to where it ends in 1960, I guess, and go through with the rest of the program. So the man in the studio there says I'm down to the last 30 seconds and beat the red hand around the clock. I'll have to say happy collecting, and I'll see you at the next auction where they're selling records, and if I'm interested in it, I'll bid on them. If I've already got one or two of them, I won't even bother holding my hand up. So record collecting is, I don't know, it just gets in your blood system, and no matter how old you are, there's always got to be another record you got to have or something else, and so I guess that is about all I've got to say on the subject. Okay.
Ten more laps. 10 more laps. 10 more laps. 10 more laps to go. My 66 model has been raring to go. I worked a lot of hours getting her ready to go.